Harvard Divinity School.
Black Freedom and the Racialization of Religious Excitement in American Psychiatry, February 29th, 2024.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this weekend symposium on Black religion and mental health. Thank you for joining us, both in person and those of you who are online. Before we begin the formal program, I'd like to acknowledge the professors, Ahmad Greene-Hayes and George Aumoithe. Did I say that right? Aumoithe. See, I should have pronounced it before I got on stage. George Aumoithe, who proposed this interdisciplinary symposium integrating mind, brain, and behavior insights into the exploration of Black religious practices and their impact on mental health. As you will see over the next 2 days, Ahmad and George have brought together a stunning array of experts across many fields, including African American studies, civics, history, psychiatry, public health, and religious studies, with a focus on understanding the neurobiological and socio-behavioral dynamics contributing to mental health stigmatization within Black communities. Some may wonder what religion has to do with neurobiology and the need for mental health support. To that, I say, you are absolutely in the right place at the right time. Throughout this symposium, the following question will be explored. How can Black religious spaces enhance mental health outcomes, considering these spaces' dual role as both sanctuaries and potential impediments to open discourse? In my own research with religion and inequality, a topic that I spent more than a year exploring as president of the American Academy of Religion in 2021, the many multifaceted intersections of religion with our lives came into clearer focus. As we wrestled with the intersections of race and class and religion, it was clear that religion often plays a significant role in people's lives, from our most private moments to the grandest of public scales. To reiterate a point that I made with the AAR, religion can aid and abet just as it disrupts and averts. It can act as both a wound and a salve, a virus, if you will, and a vaccine. And no less so when we think about the intersections between religion and mental health. And we, as scholars and supporters of scholarly work, are called upon to make sense of it all, to help disaggregate the parts into a meaningful and coherent whole, to foster excellence in the academic study of religion and enhance the public understanding of religion and its many intersections with our daily life is a lofty charge indeed, but ever more needed in these particular times. As higher education faces division and conflict and public scrutiny, I want to underscore the deep importance of the work that we do here at Harvard Divinity School. We are a community that stands on 3 pillars: academics, ministry, and religion and public life. And while we study intently the nature of religious conflict, whether it is the scriptural texts and interpretations that give rise to it, or the historical nature of it, we also hold in tension the reality that religion has been and can be a powerful force for good in the world. I truly thank each of you, faculty, staff, alumni, students, and friends, for your commitment to the teaching and learning that happens here at Harvard Divinity School and around the globe, with the vital connections you all make near and far. One last note of appreciation before we welcome Dr. Judith Weisenfeld a good friend and an extraordinary scholar, to the stage for her keynote address. This symposium came to fruition in large part to our organizers, Ahmad Greene-Hayes and George Aumoithe. What? So the spelling is so different from the sound. So every time I look at it, I get confused, but it's in my head before I look at it. Who exemplify what it means to amplify teaching and learning through connections that defy academic and geographic boundaries. Thank you for creating a forum for colleagues from across Harvard and across the United States to delve into critical discussions about Black religion and mental health. Thank you both. Appreciate it. George.
Well, good evening, everyone. How are you? Hope you're well. So I'm Dr. George Aumoithe. I am an assistant professor of history and African American studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And first of all, I'd really like to thank the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute for allowing us to co-convene Dr. Ahmad Greene-Hayes and I across two schools to have this really important interdisciplinary conversation that I think is also timely and very important for us to hold. So I just want to provide a little bit of framing around the sort of professional context for our convening today. According to the Association of Black Psychologists, of 1.2 million behavioral health providers in the US in 2020, nationally, 4% of psychologists, 2% of psychiatrists, 7% of marriage and family counselors, 11% of professional counselors, and 22% of social workers are Black. While these ratios represent a numerical improvement from the early 20th century state of Black mental health representation, where scholars like Elizabeth Lundbeck and our very own Martin Summers have identified a handful of professional psychologists and psychiatrists who provided care in the immediate post-war period, Black people remain underrepresented in the highest echelons of professional care. We also need to think about certain lingering issues such as the mistreatment of patients in psychiatric wards, or the violence emanating out of encounters with police as first responders, or even the violence emerging from vigilante actors who intervene when someone is in distress, illustrated by the tragic killing of Jordan Neely by former Marine Daniel Penny after Penny placed Neely in an extended chokehold on a New York City subway. Whether the historically poor representation of Black people in mental health professions or understanding Black people's indigenous mental health practices and how they intersect with our spiritual practices, our symposium promises to deepen our historical and practical knowledge. Today, we begin with Dr. Judith Weisenfeld's research on the racialization of religious excitement in American psychiatry. Tomorrow, we hear from historians, religious scholars, community organizers, policy experts, and mental health practitioners who will shed light on the intersection of Black religious communities and the acceptance of and stigma against mental health care. In our dialogue, one question we might ponder as a group is, how do we seize the opportunities inherent to open dialogue and avoid the pitfalls of historic distrust between religious and mental health institutions? Over tonight's talk and tomorrow's plenary gathering, I look forward to exploring institutional accountability and identifying non-institutional practices and solutions. But I also hope we can explore the structure around care, structures that include housing, education, and treatment. For without an awareness of this overarching structure within our discussion of the intersection between religion and mental health access, we leave with a potentially incomplete picture of the social problems that confront us. So on that note, and to get to why we are all here, I want to warmly welcome Dr. Ahmad Greene-Hayes to introduce today's opening keynote. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Dean Frederick and Dr. Aumoithe for those wonderful comments getting us started this evening. I want to also provide some framing, though from the context of the study of Black religion for our gathering. I think it's important to note that at the time when we proposed this symposium to the Interfaculty Initiative for Mind, Behavior, and Brain study, we were thinking in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also we were thinking collectively about the incessant threats on Black people's lives, wherein mental health awareness remains a pivotal point of public health discourses. And so this gathering came about immediately in the wake of the violent murder of Jordan Neely, a Black homeless man who was strangled to death by Daniel Penny, a white vigilante. Neely's death, like the deaths of so many Black people across the globe, was recorded and circulated across the internet. Neely, who struggled with mental health challenges, poverty, and houselessness, was deemed unworthy, and his predicament a sight for a spectacle on a New York City subway train as onlookers recorded but did not intervene to save his Black life. Whether it be the everyday reality of anti-Black racism, the epigenetic memory of the transatlantic slave trade, including Harvard and the legacy of slavery, or other biological, social, and political factors, many Black people like Neely live with depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. Like our enslaved ancestors who lived in disabled bodies because of the brutal whip of the slave master and the planter class, many people of African descent also navigate mental disabilities in a world that actively shames the Black and disabled. In response to this reality, Black religious spaces, especially and often perhaps too prominently, Black Protestant churches are often situated as havens and sanctuaries to survive the pressures of living while Black in America. Despite this historical reality, Black religious spaces struggle to discuss mental health awareness openly and transparently, due largely to what the Harvard historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham long described as the politics of respectability in her 1993 book, Righteous Discontent. So this evening, our keynote speaker, Dr. Judith Weisenfeld, will help us unpack this troubled legacy. Dr. Weisenfeld, who also was my graduate advisor at Princeton University, and I'm very grateful for her mentorship and friendship now at this stage in my career. But she is the Agate Brown and George L. Collard Professor of Religion and the chair of the Department of Religion at Princeton University, where she is also associated faculty in the Department of African American Studies and the program in Gender and Sexuality Studies. She is a scholar of African American religious history. Her books include New World of Coming, Black Religion and Racial Identity During the Great Migration, which won the 2017 Albert J. Rabbitoe Prize for the best book in Africana religions. She is also the author of Hollywood Be Thy Name, African American Religion and American Film, 1929 to 1949, and African American Women in Christian Activism, New York's Black YWCA, 1905 to 1945. She currently directs the Crossroads Project, Black Religious Histories, Communities and Cultures, which is supported by a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. Her current research project, which I think the current title of the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Racial Commitments, African American Religion and American Psychiatry, is currently examining the intersections of psychiatry, race, and African American religion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and has been supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the John Guggenheim Foundation. She is a stellar scholar and thinker, and so we're so grateful to have her here at Harvard Divinity School. And so without further ado, if you could please greet her with a rousing round of applause.
Thank you, Ahmad and George. I'm really honored to have been invited to start this off. I'm really excited to be in conversation with everyone over the course of this symposium. to be here under the leadership of Dean Marla Frederick. I used to say Marla Frederick was my president back in the day when she was AAR president. Now she's the dean. All right. On September 2nd, 1893, 45-year-old May W. was committed to the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum, having been declared by 2 physicians to be insane, and their judgment affirmed by a probate judge in Sumter County, where May lived. It's not clear how May, a married farmer who belonged to the Methodist Church and had most likely been born into slavery, had come to the attention of authorities, but it was his religious expression that persuaded the examining doctors, both white and one the son of a Methodist minister, that he was mentally ill. The doctors testified that while they believed there were predisposing factors underlying his condition, and they named heredity and malaria, they felt the immediate cause of May's insanity in the form of acute mania was religious excitement, manifested in what they characterized as the delusional belief that, quote, he is in direct communication with the Holy Spirit, end quote. Now, there's little more in May's patient record from the hospital than a transcription of the brief account contained in the commitment paperwork and an affirmation of the local doctor's initial diagnosis of acute mania caused by religious excitement. He was declared recovered and released from the asylum 2 months later. May W.'s diagnosis of mania precipitated by religious excitement was common among Southern Black people committed to asylums in the late 19th century. In the wake of slavery and in a period during which African Americans deemed mentally ill increasingly came under the jurisdiction of these state hospitals, many of these hospitals listed religious excitement as among the most frequent precipitating causes for Black inmates. Overall, unknown cause, when one goes through the annual reports and the records, unknown cause generally constitutes the highest number, but religious excitement was often among the top listed supposed known causes. So this idea that religious excitement, religious excess, or improper religion from one's perspective was not, that this could produce insanity was not new at this time in American history, nor was the diagnosis or the causal factor applied only to Black people in the United States, and there's a history beyond the US as well. In the US, some medical, religious, and cultural authorities connected new forms of religious expressions to mental disorder over American history, pre-American history, including those of Shakers in the 18th century, Christian Scientists, Millerites, Mormons, and spiritualists in the 19th century, and holiness and Pentecostal believers in the 20th century, among others. And recall that what the doctors who testified in May W.'s commitment hearing, that what they found delusional was his belief in the possibility of a direct connection with the Holy Spirit, a characteristic of holiness theology, which had become, by that time, a significant component of Black religious culture. Even as medical authorities evaluated a range of religious expressions as disordered or potentially disordering, early white psychiatrists positioned African Americans uniquely within a diagnostic and treatment frame premised on the notion of a racially distinctive mind that had particular religious manifestations, right? That structured their behavior as much as did individual experience. So the idea of the racial mind is mobilized as much or more in some cases. White American doctors assigned religious causes to mental illness in patients from a variety of backgrounds across this period. So the application of religious excitement is not limited to African Americans, but for no other group in American mental hospitals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the attribution of mental illness to religious causes as prominent as for African Americans. So I argue in the book that over the course of this period, the idea of religious excitement as part of a disordered mental state becomes racialized as Black. And here's one set of data for looking at that. This is data drawn from Virginia hospitals, which is useful because Central Hospital, the dark blue bar, housed Black patients only, and the other hospitals had white patients. And looking at, again, the attribution of religious excitement in annual reports over this period, you can see the disparity here. And I found this in other archives and other looking at other state hospital reports. So religious excitement becomes racialized as Black, and the theories early white psychiatrists developed to account for what they believed was a connection between religion and mental illness for Black people extended beyond individual cases like May's to contribute to the larger corpus of race science that shaped American politics, public policy, and daily life, and pathologized Black cultures, expressions, and being. In the larger project, I chart how ideas about religion came to occupy a prominent place in late 19th and early 20th century white doctors' theories of an essential Black mind, the essential nature of the Black mind, and indeed a central place in their own theories of religion. I explore how the theories and practices these doctors developed and promoted influenced Black people's possibilities for enacting freedom, and how, by framing their religious expressions as potentially pathological. It's difficult to recover the experiences of patients like May W., who were diagnosed with religiously grounded mental illness and consigned to state hospitals. And you see here some of the commitment paperwork and then the campus of that hospital in a slightly later period. The records of the legal process through which people were committed to state mental hospitals, whether initiated at the request of family members or a directive from white authorities to evaluate an individual held in jail or resident in an almshouse or other institutions, these records privilege the voices of witnesses, particularly of local white doctors, as well as family, neighbors, and sometimes white employers. When patients' perspectives are represented, they're generally secondhand accounts offered by police or the examining physicians, and again, family, community witnesses, journalists. Sometimes the cases become public. Surviving patient records from state hospitals in the late 19th century often contain little more than information transferred from the commitment paperwork, as I've said. On occasion, patient files contain correspondence from family members, and by the early 20th century, they might include photographs or daily ward notes, more extensive case histories when those come into use. Many records from state hospitals, particularly those for institutions that house Black patients only, have not been retained in state archives, as was the case for the medical records of Virginia's Central State Hospital, as I mentioned, although the records of the hospitals for white patients in Virginia are in the state archives, and West Virginia's Lakin State Hospital, which I'll talk about later. And in other cases, health privacy laws restrict access to all patient records or limit access to those that date earlier than the late 19th century. So these are the constraints on this kind of research. The available records, both legal and medical, though, offer some insight into the stakes and consequences of Black people being characterized as suffering from or manifesting a religious insanity in this period. Even the limited available records show the prominence of religious factors in diagnosis and allow us to see individuals who were grappling with generations of racial trauma and responding in and through religious vernacular. Certainly not all determinations of insanity or commitments to hospitals in the late 19th century and early 20th century US can be attributed solely to white political and social efforts to marginalize and oppress Black people, but racialized psychiatric theory about disordered religious minds affected individual experiences within the legal and medical systems that evaluated Black people's sanity in this period. So in the project, I offer a broad analysis of the significance of racialized ideas about religion to early American psychiatry, proceeding with some trepidation at all that comes with the work of charting the history of medical racism, and the questions about whether explicating racist thought and presenting it here and in writing, whether that simply reproduces the violence of history and the archive. But I think it's important to engage this history and to see how, as white doctors asserted distinct disciplinary authority over the definitions of the normal and the insane, they also worked to define the very category of religion in racialized ways, situating white Protestantism as the norm. Many of the early white psychiatrists or psychiatric theorists of religion, race, and mental illness among African Americans worked in Southern state hospitals where Black patients were most likely to be treated. Most of them were active in mainstream Protestant churches, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, and a striking number came from enslaving families or had themselves enslaved Black people. And we can see when we look at their context and their histories how early racialized psychiatric theories that centered Black religions did not represent a contest between white secular medical authority and Black religious ways of knowing, but the engagement of two broad religious worldviews in contexts of unequal power and access to authorizing structures. So I want to underscore, and I will, the religious basis of white doctors' religious or interpretations of Black religion. In the first address before the members of the National Conference of Charities and Correction on the topic of insanity among people of African descent in the United States, Superintendent of the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane, James Woods Babcock, a Presbyterian and son of a Confederate veteran, expressed worry. Babcock informed his fellow white physicians and social welfare workers that since the end of slavery, diagnoses of insanity among Southern African Americans had increased rapidly and was placing great stress on the ability of institutions to deal with what he characterized as, quote, this constant accumulation of lunatics, end quote. Citing federal census data, he charted a national increase from 175 colored insane per million inhabitants in 1850 to 886 per million in 1890. And he contended that while the reported proportion of insane people of African descent was higher in northern states in 1890, the increasing number in the South was striking. Dr. M.L. Perry, an active Baptist, son of a Confederate veteran, and pathologist at the Georgia State Sanitarium at Milledgeville, joined in this assessment from his perspective a few years later, writing that, quote, in 40 years, the total Negro population of the state has been a little more than doubled, while the number of insane has increased 20-fold. No other such rapid and radical change in the mental stability of a race is recorded in history, end quote. So what did these white physicians think had caused this increase? As many historians have shown, Babcock contributed to a discourse, and he told his audience that day that he believed unfitness for freedom was the cause. He argued, and many white physicians in hospitals for the insane concurred, that emancipation had propelled formerly enslaved Black people into, in his words, a world of mental excitement from which, he insisted, slavery had long shielded them. The mental disturbance, wait till you hear it. The mental disturbance, late 19th and early 20th century white physicians believed Black freedom produced was not uniform, and they elaborated factors they imagined precipitated mental illness in what Baptist deacon and former enslaver J.D. Roberts, who was a physician at North Carolina's Eastern Hospital, called the clash with civilization. These precipitating factors included such things as heredity, senility, injury, alcoholism, syphilis, so physical causes, but the certainty of white medical professionals that along with these religious excitement spurred by what Babcock described as agitating novelties in religion, that religious excitement contributed significantly to psychological disorder in Black people is a striking feature of these accounts. and other physicians concurred. Methodist and Union Army veteran A.B. Richardson, who was served a term as the superintendent of the government hospital for the insane in Washington, D.C., known as St. Elizabeth's, he told the Washington Post in 1901 that there had been a dramatic increase in the number of patients admitted to the institution in recent years, asserting that, quote, "It is true that religious mania is a symptom of many of those admitted. All classes have increased in the same proportion with the exception of Negroes. They have gained most rapidly," end quote. And here we see an example of diagnosis and description of the supposed cause of insanity for a patient at St. Elizabeth's. We see Charles K., a North Carolina native, was admitted to the hospital in 1896, diagnosed as suffering from acute mania caused by religious excitement. And the hospital staff's daily ward notes indicate that he was occasionally violent, and they described him as imagining, quote, that he is God and rules the world, end quote, and that he talked about the Bible and preaching the gospel constantly in their account. Charles's condition seems to have improved over time, and he was moved successively into wards and buildings in which patients received somewhat less oversight and could be engaged in outdoor labor. In the records that remain, his two recorded requests were to attend chapel, as he was eager, this is from a later period, the chapel, quote, eager to prove that he could behave himself, end quote, and to be able to work outside, both of which he was eventually allowed to do. Charles died of coronary disease at the approximate age of 49, 6 years after being admitted to St. Elizabeth's. Charles was like many other Black patients in American hospitals for the insane in this period, who had likely been born into slavery and struggled financially after emancipation in ways that may have exacerbated or been exacerbated by mental illness. White psychiatrists' consideration of patients like Charles K. among the growing number of diagnoses of mental illness among Black people invoked the disruptions of emancipation as the proximate social context, and no doubt the formerly enslaved experienced tremendous stress and trauma. But these explanations were grounded in a broader and more enduring field of racialized beliefs about normal and disordered minds, and often the relation of religion to these states, and again, capacity for freedom, ideas about this. And here you see some of the titles of the published literature in this period. None of the titles talk about religion, but religion is a very prominent factor within this body of literature. And you can see this kind of emerging specialty that these people these doctors announce themselves, create themselves as race experts in this period. The attention Babcock and other white doctors, mostly from Southern hospitals, gave to the increase in diagnoses of mental illness among African Americans in this period emerged within and contributed to the era's hardening systems of segregation and racial containment that shaped Charles's young adulthood. Potential for incarceration in a variety of institutions, including jails, penitentiaries, Magdalene houses, and poorhouses, shadowed African Americans in the Jim Crow era, and commitment to mental institutions loomed as another possibility. And indeed, many Black patients were sent to hospitals from county jails, prisons, or poorhouses. Charles was transferred from the almshouse. In cases in which violence or crime occurred, the determination of criminal agency or mental illness took place through a combination of local, legal, political, and social cultures, along with medical standards of the day, including this body of theory about religious causes. So in this period in which African Americans were forging cultures and communities in slavery's wake, they came under the scrutiny of white psychiatrists, police, judges, who applied racialized ideas about religion and mental normalcy, and they were sometimes, and again increasingly, consigned to this expanding system of state mental hospitals, local hospitals sometimes. In accounting for and responding to what they saw as an emerging medical and social crisis, late 19th and early 20th century white psychiatrists produced theories of religion that became constitutive elements of their racialized understandings of the normal and disordered mind. Now, as a precipitating factor for mental illness, this idea of excessive religious excitement, as Georgia State Sanitarium Clinical Director E.M. Greene called it, he was the son of a Presbyterian minister and grandson of an enslaver. This idea of excessive religious excitement was not a neutral notion. Like so much about valuations of religion in American culture, interpretations of religious expression, whether restrained and appropriate or excited and excessive, these were often racialized and gendered, as were assessments of theologies and forms of religious organization. White psychiatrists frequently invoked religious beliefs, sensibilities, and practices in their claims about the hereditary, historical, and social causes of mental instability among Black people. And they framed it, again, through the lens of white supremacy, American racial hierarchy, their own family investments in the economic exploitation of Black people, and their own religious commitments, again, most often to Protestant denominations in this period. So what were the main elements of these racialized theories of religion and mental normalcy? It was routine for white psychiatric practitioners to frame their addresses and publish studies about Black mental illness by constructing and rehearsing a trajectory from what they characterized as savagery with its religious connotations through enslavement to recent emancipation. St. Elizabeth's Hospital psychiatrist Mary O'Malley began her study of psychoses among Black people with the assertion that, quote, only 300 years ago, the Negro ancestors of this race were naked dwellers on the west coast of Africa, found by the slave traders in the depths of savagery and suddenly transplanted to an environment of the highest civilization, and 250 years later had all the responsibilities of this higher race thrust upon them, end quote. And while the many, many, many similar accounts that historian Martin Summers describes as rising to the level of genre, these many accounts mark change over time from Africa to the United States. White psychiatrists insisted on the lack of civilizational development or progress on the part of African Americans. John Lind, O'Malley's colleague at St. Elizabeth's, asserted in one study, quote, because he, the Negro, wears a Palm Beach suit instead of a string of cowries, his psychology is no less that than the African and betrays the savage heart beneath the civilized exterior, end quote. And these medical evaluations of African and African American culture claimed stunted growth because of cultural immaturity deriving from what these white psychiatrists presented as essential race traits. Another grounding assumption in these medical discussions about African Americans and mental illness was that insanity did not exist among Africans in Africa. American neurologist George M. Beard, the son of a Congregationalist minister, who in 1869 described neurasthenia, a disease of nervous exhaustion, built his theory in part on the idea that Africans and Native Americans did not experience mental illness. In his 1881 American Nervousness, he asserted with confidence, quote, where there is no civilization, there is no nervousness, no matter what the personal habits may be, even though the experiment be made, as in Africa, for centuries, end quote. So, and for these theorists and medical practitioners, the idea that mental illness was largely absent in Africa did not serve as an argument for the hardiness or superiority of African psychology, but simply a backdrop for them to assert African Americans' essential unfitness for civilization as typified in American society, culture, and religion. Another core component was the claim that slavery had been a benevolent institution for Black people's moral, mental, and physical health. From his position as superintendent of the Eastern Hospital in Goldsboro, North Carolina, that housed exclusively Black patients, active Southern Methodist layman J.F. Miller, whose family had enslaved dozens of Black people, summed up the opinion of many white psychiatrists of the beneficial environment of slavery for Black people's mental and moral well-being. Quote, "It is an undisputed fact known to our Southern people that no race of men ever lived under better hygienic restraint or had governing their lives rules and regulations more conducive to physical health and mental repose. Freedom came to the Negro and a change came over his entire life," end quote. So what did late 19th century psychiatrists mean when they diagnosed African American patients as suffering from mental illness, either mania or melancholy in this period, caused or precipitated by religious excitement? I see religious excitement as serving as an umbrella term that white psychiatrists discussed in relation to what they imagined as several constituent components of the Black psyche, and I'll talk about two here: superstition and emotionalism. White psychiatrists mobilized ideas about African religions as not real religion and evaluated their Black patients' references to certain understandings of the supernatural as indications of the racial trait of Negro superstition. These understandings of the supernatural included the Africana spiritual practice of conjure that combined mental and spiritual resources to heal or harm, and mentions of supernatural beings like witches and their interactions with humans. St. Elizabeth's Hospital's William Bevis asserted in 1921 that, quote, "Nothing in the life of the Negro stands out more prominently than his superstition. It influences his thought and conduct more than anything else. In no other trait or peculiarity do we find more plainly the imprint of the primitive African life and customs," end quote. Many white psychiatrists in this literature argued that what they viewed as African superstitions as manifest in African American life were all-consuming and tyrannical. E.M. Greene, again the clinical director of the Georgia State Sanitarium, argued in 1914 that, quote, "From the cradle, the Negro lives in the fear of the supernatural. As an infant, he is threatened with beasts, spooks, and witches. In childhood, the chief subject of conversation which he overhears subjects are witchcraft, spells, ghosts, and conjuring. Every sickness is attributed to the agency of poison, every misfortune to that of witchcraft," end quote. Now, it's not uncommon in the records of commitment hearings to find African Americans attributing mental disturbance to the effects of conjure. When 21-year-old Mary J. was brought from the Richmond County, Virginia jail in 1885 to stand before justices of the peace for a determination on her sanity, the examining physicians reported that religious excitement was the supposed cause of her illness and that she complained, and here you can see, that of being tricked or conjured. Mary had been arrested and charged with disorderly conduct once before this, but in this case, it's likely that her assertion of belief in conjure, right, that is her investment in the spiritual system of regulating interpersonal relations and health through appeal to natural and supernatural forces, this claim of being tricked is what led the doctor's characterization of her as suffering from religious excitement and her commitment to the Central State Asylum for Colored Insane. And there are many cases like this in the archives. In addition to the idea that African Americans experienced a kind of mental terror because of their presumed racial propensity for superstitious belief and failure to relegate religion to a limited arena of life, psychiatric assessments of the state of Black mental health generally presented emotional and spiritual excess, always set against moral and ethical concern as the substance of Black religion. Georgia's E.M. Greene asserted that, quote, "The Negro's religious convictions are most superficial. And while a great churchgoer, easily swayed by religious oratory and capable of excessive religious excitement, he has no realization of the basic principles of religion and gives way to all kinds of moral derelictions while professing deepest piety, end quote. And again, this is a kind of generic statement that one finds in lots of this theory. So these ideas about Black religious emotional excess would frame interpretations of Black church worship, of Black participation in late 19th century revivals and early 20th century Pentecostalism, as well as a host of individual, visionary, and ecstatic religious expressions. Such assertions by white commentators of what they believed was the nature of African and African diaspora religion, primitive, superstitious, emotional, lacking in ethics and morals, and even contagious, can be found in literature before the era of the professionalization of psychiatry and in a range of contemporaneous social, scientific, and theological literature. Curtis Evans has written very helpfully about this. Something else is at stake, however, when such racialized theories of religion become part of a medical specialty that has the capacity to link longstanding racialized constructions of deviant culture and religion to biological conceptions of the normal mind. The racialized biologizing of mental normalcy and deviance factored in the transition in the 1910s and 20s from the diagnostic categories of mania and melancholy, where then religious excitement was sometimes listed as a precipitating factor, to dementia precox in the 1910s and 20s, literally premature, precocious dementia. Dementia precox and manic depressive psychosis came into widespread use in diagnoses of mental illness in the US through the work of German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who theorized this psychosis as deriving from underlying metabolic factors common to all humans, Kraepelin has a complicated history, but theoretically, it doesn't have an obvious racial frame to it. As embraced by American psychiatrists, race became an important factor in its application, supporting the idea, as historian Jonathan Metzl writes, that Black people were biologically unfit for freedom. As white American psychiatrists deployed Kraepelin's new disease categories in the early 20th century, they linked racialized discourses about religion from the older diagnostic system to the new. And in fact, Kraepelin himself read these studies and was influenced by them, by the way white American psychiatrists interpreted it. So when Minnesota-born active Methodist Ara Evarts, a psychiatrist at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, turned her attention in the 1910s to research on dementia precox among African Americans, she highlighted literature from the history of religions as the interpretive key for diagnosing and treating Black patients. She relied heavily on social anthropologist James G. Fraser's The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, as she worked to consider the relationship among ancient human patterns, her ideas about innate Black racial traits, and her opinions on contemporary Black experience. So she was charting these three factors in a study assessing psychoses of the title, Psychoses of the Colored Race. So she argued for the importance in assessing psychoses of recognizing ontogenetic influences, the actual memories of individuals, and phylogenetic or evolutionary inheritances, for her seen most clearly in remnants of shared human religious expressions. According to Evarts, or she's setting out to study again, are Black, as the diagnostic categories change, she wants to know, are Black people more likely to suffer from this new disease or newly described disease? According to Evarts, Black and white patients were not entirely distinct in terms of the phylogenetic or evolutionary elements of their manifestations of dementia precox. And in this article, she gives the example of a white male patient at St. Elizabeth's. She describes him as out of touch with reality. She says he has the mannerism, quote, the mannerism of standing with head bowed and hands folded in a devotional attitude, end quote. And she says he has a jerking, shuffling walk. She concluded that although he was unaware of what he was doing, quote, we can scarce avoid the conclusion that it is a fragment of a religious ritual, end quote. She said it was suggestive of a May Day march or a mummers parade. She described a Black female patient similarly detached from reality who, quote, bends slightly backward with chest elevated and assumes a facial expression intended to be terrifying, end quote. The woman, she said, spits, snorts, stamps her feet, waves her skirt, all the while producing what Evarts described as terrifying grimaces. This, she concluded, using Fraser as a guide, was also a phylogenetic parallel of ancient rituals and ceremonies, in this case, she said, among savages, meant to scare away demons. But where she saw the white man's manifestation of this ritual as fragmentary, incomplete, suggestive of ancient rituals, she insisted that the Black woman's expression was much more recognizable and complete because, in her words, quote, the colored race is so much nearer its stage of barbarism, end quote. And she asserted the prominence of, quote, hoodoos, conjures, and spells, end quote, in Black culture, established that insanity among African Americans was both the product, was a product both of these ancient inheritances and, in her view, this kind of proximity of what she said, the primitive method of thought that was an integral part of the race. And it was her reading of Fraser on talisman, spells, contagious magic, and sorcery that confirmed this assessment. Her footnotes are just full of references to this. Most white psychiatrists who published articles and delivered addresses about Black people and mental illness in this period were associated with one of the many state hospitals for the insane, primarily in the South in the late 19th century, but representing a broader geography into the 20th century. The frameworks they developed, offering medical evidence for the purported connection between insanity and what they imagined as African savagery, Black people's unfitness for civilization and freedom, propensity for superstitious belief, and overly emotional religious practice, this framework became authoritative and influential well into the 20th century, maybe even now. There were few Black physicians specializing in psychiatry in this early period to weigh in on these issues. Constantine Clinton Barnett, who was a graduate of Howard University Medical School and the son of a prominent Baptist pastor in Huntington, West Virginia, and a first cousin of historian Carter G. Woodson, was unusual in that he had charge of a state mental institution. In 1926, Barnett became the first superintendent of West Virginia's Lakin State Hospital for the colored insane, and his wife, Clara Matthews Barnett, a nurse, became the hospital's matron. They had run a cottage hospital prior to this. Barnett believed that the study of, in his words, religion, mythology, magic, and sociology, that this was vital for psychiatrists. And in some ways, his views on the relationship of religion to the manifestation of mental illness among his patients bore some relation to theories put forth by white psychiatrists in the decades before he began his work. But Barnett argued for consideration of culture rather than racial traits, albeit in the context of an implicit cultural and religious hierarchy. He would be joined in the 1930s by several psychiatrists at the Tuskegee Veterans Hospital, most notably George S. Moore, the son of a Congregationalist minister. And it's very striking to me that this set of these very first Black psychiatrists are sons of clergy. They would contribute to a shift in the field from arguments about race and religion as setting the terms for the development of mental illness to questions about environment and discrimination. And I see them as kind of heralding a broader change that comes about, certainly by the 1940s in American psychiatry. So my larger project examines the stakes of psychiatric interpretations of Black religious life from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century, with several significant changes in the later period, which I'm happy to mention, with the aim of offering a broad analysis of the significance of religion and race to early American psychiatry, and of psychiatry's role in defining the bounds of religion in American culture and shaping the possibilities of Black freedom in slavery's wake. And so I'm eager to learn from the expertise and wisdom here to consider the afterlives of the racialization of religious excitement. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Weisenfeld, for that really enlightening lecture. We have lots of time for Q&A, and so I imagine that there are questions for Dr. Weisenfeld. As you all think about those questions, I guess I will offer one question I think that's looming on the project. I couldn't help but think about images of African Americans who have been institutionalized, who come out of religious communities. So I'm thinking of course, Malcolm X's mother, who faces immense state pressure. The taking Elijah Muhammad's family. Also thinking about James Baldwin's father or stepfather. Polly Murray, yeah, the list is quite extensive. And in some ways, I wonder if you have an account about how the field of African American religious history engages with these figures. In some ways, they are always on the periphery of concern, but they're so central to the biographical accounts, right, of these figures. James Baldwin, in particular, writes about that kind of patriarchal relationship and its impact on his identity. But I'm curious about how an analysis of mental illness like reconfigures how we even interpret someone like Baldwin. So I'm just curious if you could comment about that, and then if any other questions emerge, we'll go from there. And we have two wonderful graduate assistants, Ramin on this side and Destiny on that side, who have microphones. And thank you both for all of your help today. And also Susu in the back. I meant to shout Susu out, who has been amazing for all of the planning. The three of them have just been incredible. So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I actually found, so Jacob Lawrence is another figure who willingly entered a hospital. I found his grandfather in an archive, also committed to a state mental hospital for religious excitement, which, yeah, is fascinating. So the intergenerational question is really profound. I mean, I think I came to this project from the last one because I was reading about the published psychiatric studies from the 1930s about followers of Father Divine, and it was this kind of cottage industry among Bellevue Hospital psychiatrists to write these studies, and so I started thinking about the broader question of that in that project of what did it mean for a kind of multi-layered pathologizing of people who are in these new religious movements. Cult does some of that work, right? Then sending them for psychiatric evaluation. And in doing that project, I read that Elijah Muhammad was diagnosed with dementia praecox when he was imprisoned for draft evasion. I mean, I think just the thing I've come out of all of this is that thinking about is how important it is to really understand the cultural meaning of that at that time for these different figures. And it's a balance that I'm not sure I strike well, although I said something about it, is that these are mechanisms of constraint and containment, And that is the case for early Pentecostalism, for the Nation of Islam, for Father Divine's movement. And yet there are also cases where people are in distress and need care. There are cases where it may be containment, but it's a containment that's happening through through a frame that may not be exactly the same at every given time. And so it has been very daunting for me. I'm a scholar of religion. I'm not a historian of medicine or anything, to kind of figure out what all of this is. Thank you, Martin Summers, for your work. And I think it matters to be really careful about that. I mean, again, we see this with Dr. Hux's work, that the in-depth explication of the mechanisms of white supremacy is important. And so that's another way that I think it's just easy to gloss and say, oh, Malcolm X's mother was institutionalized. I've said that, a million times, but I don't know. Now I think, well, what exactly was happening? And when I went back and I read Elijah Muhammad's FBI file, and there is a piece of the hospital record in there, it's very complicated and really textured, and tells me something more than I had thought about before. I don't know if that's a great.
Thank you, Judith, for such a wonderful talk. The entire time you were providing your lecture, I was thinking about the social sciences and the racism embedded in the founding of the social sciences. And, I think about anthropology, the work Lee Baker has done to kind of excavate that history, sociology, the work Alden Morris has done talking about Du Bois and sociology. And so I was curious about psychiatry. And you mentioned 1940 as maybe the start of a turning point. I wanted to know if you would elaborate a bit on kind of that history in psychiatry, because even in anthropology, Du Bois, Boaz is ostracized because he's challenging the ways in which race is seen as kind of biological in anthropology. Later on, Herskovits as well in some ways. And so I'm just curious what that battle looks like in psychiatry and how long it took and who was involved, if you know any of that history.
That's a great question. The way I write about that, I foreground E. Franklin Frazier, and name's escaping me right now. In conversation with people like George S. Moore. There's another. Actually, Horace Mann Bond would be another key figure. So those two social scientists are writing in the 1930s, late 20s and 30s, as this set of psychiatrists at Tuskegee Veterans Hospital begin to do this shift. And I see Bond as really important, actually, in arguing. I mean, he's got a piece where he does a cutting analysis of all of this white psychiatric theory. And he's like, none of these statistics from these hospitals that are just gussied up jails, they tell us nothing, and we need to go and think really differently. So I want to locate those, so people like Bond and Frazier, and this early group of psychiatrists as starting this in the 1930s. So I kind of put it back a little bit earlier than maybe some of the material I've read. The psychiatrists are trained by, or they're kind of supported by, his name too is going to escape me. Oh, Solomon Carter Fuller, who's the first Black psychiatrist. And he is the son of medical missionaries who went to Liberia. And so he also has a church background, and he supports them. So it's a kind of early period. And then really through World War II changes American psychiatry a lot. And people begin to think more about context and trauma, and in ways that start to reshape the field. But some of the early, the people who are doing that work are reading Boas, right? So anthropologists are actually really important to that turn as well. So, even though as I was working on the 19th century, I was always saying, I'm only working on these kind of MDs in these hospitals. But as I went over a longer period, I realized how important some of the Black social scientists were to the turn, and how important the marginalized anthropologists were to how psychiatry was starting to change. I see Dr. Summers nodding, so maybe that's okay. I mean, the other thing that happens too is that this is kind of where I end, one of the places I go in the book, is that in Black communities, they start to look for other ways to provide care. So turn to the mental hygiene movement and community mental health clinics, things like that. And so they start to embrace social work even more. So I do see kind of social science and social work as really important for supporting the work that some of the Black psychiatrists want to do. Shift. Well, 2 questions there.
Thank you so much. It's such a brilliant way of reframing the production of psychiatric knowledge, and I'm to really kind of situate it within the religious thought of these psychiatrists, and I'm really looking forward to reading your work. I wanted to ask, you briefly alluded to it. The theme of the talk is the racialization of religious excitement, and you briefly alluded to kind of the gendering of religious excitement. So, because it's a lot of the people who you pointed to. Now I'm blanking on their names. Everts, Malloy, right? Yeah.
O'Malley.
O'Malley, yeah. Sorry, they're working with primarily female patients, right? And Lind is working with male patients, but one of the slides that you showed is kind of the disproportionate diagnosis of religious excitement in central state hospital, and I'm just wondering whether or not you're able to determine if more women are being diagnosed as suffering from, or the exciting causes being religious excitement, or men, or just if you could talk a little bit about that, if you're seeing that in the archives.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, being pulled into this, or following the questions I had, I thought that this was going to be a project that it's going to be more about Black women, as certainly as the majority of certain kind of formal religious contexts, but also I thought I would see ideas of hysteria or nervousness more prominently featured, and I did not find that. And then in terms of numbers, I think I cut the footnote out. There are more men in these institutions than women who are for whom religious excitement is attached to them as a cause. And I think there are a couple of reasons. I think the main reason is just that there are more men in these institutions. And the men are more likely perhaps to be institutionalized, less likely to be kind of paroled out, for example. But there's also a way that this frame of excessive emotionalism, that's a kind of, I see as a subcategory of religious excitement, serves as a way of feminizing the race. And so I think the dominant way that emotion and superstition get framed is in relation to the idea of a childlike race, right? So in the the idea of the right developmental stages of human development and racial development. But I do think that it does also work to kind of feminize. But I have statistics for several of these hospitals, and it's not a huge disproportion. It might be like high 50% men with religious excitement. And I saw it in all of the hospitals I looked at.
Hi, my name is Henry Love. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I work for an organization called WIN, and we're the largest homelessness provider in the country. And one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with right now is with street homelessness. And for a lot of us in the field of homelessness and homelessness response, we contribute a lot of it to the shutting down of those psychiatric hospitals in the 60s and the 70s. So my question is, and when we see what's happening with Jordan Neely and just even what's happening today, because a lot of those psychiatric facilities that have been shut down, we're opening them up again, and ironically enough, they're being filled with Black men, mostly migrants. And so there's this interesting sort of like through line in history, and I'm curious to know sort of like from that end-off point in the 40s, like so what sort of, as we go from the 40s into the 60s, 70s, and these facilities close down, what does that sort of legacy of religious excitement look like throughout that period? And then how do you see that through line into the present?
My book ends in 1950 something. I'll just say two things. I'll say three things. One, I can't give you a clear account because I didn't do that work. I end the book with the story of a man named George Bennett, whose life covers the whole period of the project and extends me into the 70s. He was born in North Carolina and joined, and I won't go into the details, but he really tracks so many of the developments in this period. But he ends up arrested for burglary. He's in Harlem, and he's sent to Sing Sing, and he serves a long sentence there. But he has a religious experience while he's in prison, and he is sent to a mental hospital. And he's actually very happy to be there because he's got this religious work he's writing, and he feels less surveilled there. He says, they already think I'm crazy here, so I'm not being, they just let me write this thing. And some of it is this really, it's a kind of religious critique of psychiatry. And he uses the diagnostic terms very specifically. He gets out and returns to Harlem, and he's actually not an unknown figure. His whole archive is at the Schomburg. He has a kind of self-published autobiography. He is on the radio, and he's got some ads in the newspaper in a way that made me really think differently about the community reception of somebody like him. This is not a great answer to you, but it made me, so he's out before deinstitutionalization is really ramping up, but I think it gives me a hint maybe of some other ways of thinking about how people who had been framed in this way might have functioned in their communities in the later period. That's not a great answer. The other through line that I was interested in, that it turns out my now colleague, your former colleague, Aisha Beliso de Jesus, is answering for me, is about the rise, and Terence Keel is working on this as well, the rise of excited delirium as an afterlife of this that has a direct impact on the violence that is, police violence and against Black men and men of color in many contexts, right? So she has a book coming out very soon that traces the origin of that police diagnosis to a medical examiner's pathologizing of Afro-Caribbean religions. And so it was formed in the same way that these ideas about religious excitement kind of infused this early psychiatric theory about race. And so I think, it was easy for me to think about excited delirium as maybe, just kind of holding the ideas about excessive, our bodies as necessarily excessive in certain ways, right? That is a kind of secularized narrative, but she has shown me that it is, that the religious component of that really persists. And we just, read this book. It's great.
Hi. First, I just want to say thank you for your work. Just really grateful. And it really is the bedrock of many conversations and things that we're holding in the healing justice work that I do and we do. I'm really curious. Given the current moment and some of the conversations that are happening in psychiatry and psychology, particularly like the decades-long quest to essentially find medical genetic data that validates the diagnostic criteria as has been conjured or created. I'm really curious about what your research and experience has given you in terms of insight to see what metrics were used, how those diagnostic criteria were developed, and either lack of metrics, given that conversation that's really kind of happening in a lot of healing justice and dominant spaces.
One of the things that has struck me so powerfully is just how much context shapes the production of these frames. And I was just curious about some of these doctors, and I started looking into their histories and found, this one who's publishing in the American Journal of Insanity saying slavery was the most beneficial institution for moral and mental health of Black people. His father had, enslaved 300 people. Like these kinds of, it's not, you can't, it's hard to say this because of this, but once, in the aggregate, once I kept finding, these are people who are beneficiaries of this institution, invested in all of the assumptions that support the practice of slavery, and they're also, they see themselves as a certain kind of Protestant caretaker of social systems. And I think system is really important, that there's a kind of a way that they are taking responsibility, that, once I put all of those things together and then next to this theory, it really changed how I thought about it. And it just makes me approach any kind of contemporary, I don't know, brain imaging or whatever. Like we know a lot about now. People are talking about the assumptions behind AI. What is back there that is shaping the tools and then the interpretation of the data and all of that? And I don't have any experience or expertise to do that. But I think, having myself diagnosed this world of discourse from the late 19th century and early 20th century, and thinking about what religious assumptions, what racial assumptions, what social assumptions have shaped that, lead me to ask people who know to ask those same questions about what are the new diagnostic categories and where did those come from, and to not just our colleague in the field of religious studies, John Lardis Modern, has a recent book called Neuromantic that traces the history of the brain and religion, and the religion in brain studies, and really to not concede that such an X thing is secular and scientific is what I've learned from this. Religion it's there.
Thank you, Judith, and welcome. Always a pleasure to see you, to be in your presence. I have 3 quick questions. The first one is, particularly the cases in the early 20th century, do you think that some of this is, in psychiatry, is in some ways a kind of anti-Pentecostal rise, where in Azusa Street, the sense when you really can speak to the spirit, and this really is happening, and wondering how much of that discourse is in line with this a kind of anti-Pentecostal rise. One question. The other one, there was on NPR, there was a new book that had come out about a particular mental hospital right outside of
In
Baltimore.
Maryland,
Yes,
Crownsville.
yes. And that sense that it was really understood that this mental illness was because African people had been emancipated. And instead of finding a lot of records that had to do with talk therapy or any kind of therapeutic, they found that you put them to work. And so they had them building extensive buildings throughout Maryland. And that was the therapy. If you put Black people back to work where they rightfully belong, then they will come back to their right minds. And the third piece is, as you was describing, I think it was O'Malley's of the woman and what she was doing in her face.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, wow, if you had gone to any kind of African diaspora ceremony and you see the moment of transpossession, that's exactly what it's looking like. Or if many people have seen Maya Deren's work in Haiti in that moment of transpossession, and wondering if some of that is going on in those moments of ritual. They're only temporary states because you have initiated priests and ritual specialists in order to pull you out of that. And I'm wondering, what does it mean when that may possibly be happening in a context where you don't have the kind of ritual fortification and specialists to move you in and out of those transpossessive states?
Those are 3 great questions. On the last, I'll connect the last two. Labor as treatment is part of all of these institutions, especially in the late 19th century, into the early 20th century. And these places, like you see, it's not on anymore. The South Carolina State Hospital slide I had up. These are huge complexes with farms and laundries and shoe shops, and so they're doing industry. They get an appropriation from the state, but they're also producing to support the institution and also to potentially make money. And so the annual reports are mostly financial reports. But there is the idea, certainly, that labor, right? So lunacy is an inability to manage your civil affairs in a way, right? So how do you get out? It's partly that you can prove that you can do this. But one of William Drury, who was a longtime superintendent of Central Hospital in Virginia, there's a hearing, a congressional hearing about St. Elizabeth's, and he comes to testify. So all these hospital superintendents are testifying about how they run their institutions, and in this testimony, he says, yes, we put our patients to work, and I chose not to have updated laundry equipment because the equipment we have, it takes the women longer, and they have to work harder, and they're used to it. And I mean, he says this before Congress. And Mab Segrist, who's written about the Georgia asylum, talks about the differential labor. So, and this I think was also the case in St. Elizabeth's. You see Black women in the laundry, white women might be in the sewing shop, Black men are doing hard labor, white men are fixing shoes. So it is, Segrist calls it the plantation asylum complex. And religion is part of a kind of disciplining work within the asylum. So Drury again talks about how he's relying sometimes there are chaplains, but he's relying on some local Black ministers, but he's kind of monitoring that they are providing services that are not emotional. And so people are kind of disciplining themselves into this. And I have several cases where the patients are saying, you can see them disciplining themselves to try and get out. Like, I'm going to show you I can behave. I'll go to chapel and do this sort of thing. On the Pentecostalism question, yes. And, it's definitely an anti-Pentecostal, holiness Pentecostal sensibility over the course of the late 19th into the early 20th century. And I went back to some of the early periodicals, Apostolic Truth, right from Azusa Street, to see if they had anything to say about mental illness, and they do, and which I just wasn't looking for it before. They are aware, and Heather Curtis has written this about holiness people. They're aware that they're being framed as crazy, but the paper is just full of these articles about, we're not insane, we have the cure, and it's the Holy Spirit. And there's all these dramatic stories of people who have been declared to be insane, committed to the asylum, and then at some dramatic moment or another, just about to be taken off, the Holy Spirit descends and proves, So they're in this whole, they're using this discourse and telling these stories to reframe how they're being described. And again, we have the cure, there's not the cause of mental illness.
Thank you so much for your talk. I am in a department surrounded by historians, so I'm constantly amazed at how people go into archives and come out with great grand theories that make sense. So thank you so much for the kind of data you're combing through. My question kind of goes back to a comment you had at the very beginning of your lecture, and it's more about your work than the content of what you're saying. And as you're talking about it, I feel so much violence. Like there's this violence against Black religiosity, this violence against Blackness, this violence against Black freedom, right? And how do you, as a scholar who's been working on this for years, how do you get through these kinds of materials that are harsh? And that not only are they harsh, but it's not you can say it's completely past either.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can't wait to finish this because I can't wait to stop being in it all the time. And I've never had a project like that. Like I've learned so much about the world and the past in this project, but it's really, I've reached the point where it's weighing on me now. I don't know, there are stages of it. In the research was just like, oh, I'm piecing together this whole story and look at this. But when I was in the South Carolina State Archives that have the commitment papers, there's a ton of records there and medical files that are not as detailed as I would have liked, but I don't know. I was opening up the commitment paperwork, so these long kind of tri-folded things, and I was just pulling out the envelope, opening it up, and looking for these stories, and that many of which are of violence. And I don't know. I was just in that trip. I got into this mode of just feeling like I was doing something for these people by touching these papers and opening them and closing. Like it felt like nobody had opened many of these envelopes in a long time, and so I felt of a kind of witnessing. We've talked about this actually in a session at the AAR. I will say I wrote the introduction last, and I wrote it based on actually a conference response I had done about James Baldwin's story, Death of the Prophet, which is where he writes about his father's death. His stepfather institutionalized for religious excitement at probably Pilgrim State Hospital on Long Island. And I wrote it and had, it was okay. And I got to the end of writing it, and I thought that like this is the wrong way to start this book, because it doesn't do justice to the people I found. It doesn't engage this question of what it felt like to do this research. And I keep pointing at you, Dr. Summers, but it was a file I went to find at the National Archives in the summer. It was my last trip, and it was one of the last files I found, and it was a file. In your footnotes, you had connected it to the Ara Evarts article. And I found this, and there was a photograph in there. And it's a photograph of a woman who was quite elderly, who was in there because they keep saying she's catching witches, she's catching witches. And the photograph, you see her, there are a lot of photographs in here like this, but this one really stuck with me. It's like a mugshot. And there's a white man's hand on her head. And I just, when I saw this in the archive, I was just really kind of overcome. And when I decided to get rid of that really, felt kind of heartless introduction I had drafted, I went back to her and I wrote about her. And so, I've kind of come to, and bookending, I found that George Bennett such a fascinating character, and to kind of try really hard to invest this terrible story with people who I can foreground in some way. It's hard throughout. But anyway, I ditched that, and I thought I had to start with something about how it felt for me to work with the material.
And we have one final question.
Feel a lot of pressure now with this question. So I'm Charmaine Jackman. I'm the founder of InnoPsych, and I'm a psychologist by training, and we do a lot of work around destigmatizing mental health. And your research is so important because it helps us understand why today there's stigma, why we hear these stories about these fears about hospitalization. Mm-hmm. When I work with young people and families, meeting with a psychologist or a therapist, their immediate concern is, you're going to hospitalize me, right? So this narrative has come through the generations. I was curious how the Black psychologists were received as they were countering what was known or what was thought as fact. And I'm curious, psychology has done some work, there's still a lot of work to do around apologizing for the racist ideas that they've perpetuated in the field. And I'm curious if you know what work psychiatry is doing around that as well.
Yeah, I think the American Psychiatric Association not that long ago made a public apology about some of these same issues, and they're trying to foreground some of the early Black psychiatrists. But there's probably, I'm certain there's more to do, but they're kind of in that mode of, but it happened around the time we were all in the racial reckoning. One of the outcomes of that racial reckoning is, I think, actually, is that archives have restricted them access more since that. Mab Seeger's book, Administrations of Lunacy, about the Georgia hospital, race in the Georgia hospital in Milledgeville. I read that during the pandemic. That was going to be my next stop archivally. And when I wrote to the archivist, she said, our attorneys have advised us to close these files. So, I feel I got in there under the gun. There are several great histories of institutions. But, so yeah, I think there's a lot to be done, but the constraints have become more serious, I think. More daunting. Your first question was about the Black psychiatrists. I felt like in the period I was looking at, they were working in a different world than the white psychiatrists in some ways in the earliest period, when like the 30s, when they start to come out. They're publishing in the Journal of the National Medical Association, which is the Black Medical Association, in the Journal of Negro Education. So I mean, they're talking to African Americans, and George Moore, I think it is trying to promote psychotherapy, but it's not really, yeah. But then later, there are, I'll say it's like after my book ends, but in that period, I don't, they are dismantling the psychiatric theory that has been built up, but I'm not sure who's, at a certain point, occasionally I see them footnoted in some of the literature from the 40s. So they're being read, but I'm not sure if they interact at all with the white psychiatric world. That's a good question. Thanks.
Just want to encourage everyone to come by to the James Room tomorrow. We will be having a continental breakfast at 9:30 a.m. Our first panel will begin at 10:30 a.m. With historians and religion scholars, Reverend Dr. Monica A. Coleman, Dr. Martin Summers, Dr. Stephanie Y. Evans, chaired by our very own Dr. Tracy E. Hucks, will be opening with the first plenary, followed by at 1:15 p.m. panel 2 with health practitioners, neuroscientists, psychologists, and policymakers, Savanya Brown, Dr. Henry Love, Dr. Joshua Lewis Gills, and Yolo Akili Robinson, chaired by Dr. Melissa Wood Bartholomew. And we hope that you'll also be able to join us at 3 p.m. for a very special closing community keynote conversation with our Charmaine Jackman. With that note, I hope everyone has a good evening. We're going to feed our speakers now.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard.